The Bellaire house, Ed and Lorraine Warren's Ohio investigation, built over abandoned coal mines where generations perished. This 1847 house became a feeding ground for something that watched and waited. Long before the first foundation stone settled into the Ohio soil, the land beneath what would become Bellaire had already been hollowed out, transformed into a subterranean maze of tunnels where men descended each morning with no guarantee of return. The coal mining industry that defined the region throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries extracted wealth from the earth at a price measured in lives lost to collapses, explosions, and the slow suffocation of black lung that claimed miners years after their final shift. The city of Bellaire rose above this network of abandonment, its streets and homes constructed directly over the spaces where so many had met their end in darkness. The house at 1699 Belmont Street, built in 1847 by Jacob Hetherington, sits as a monument to this layered history, a structure whose wooden beams and stone foundation rest upon grief compressed into the very bedrock. From the earliest years of its occupation, residents of the Hetherington house reported experiences that defied conventional explanation. Objects moved without human contact. Footsteps echoed through empty corridors. Shadows took form in doorways before dissipating like smoke. Generation after generation of families cycled through the property, each bringing hope that their tenure would prove different, each departing with the same haunted expressions and reluctance to speak in detail about what they had witnessed. The house developed a reputation throughout the Ohio Valley, whispered about in local historical societies, and passed along in family stories told with hushed voices. By the 1990s, the accumulated weight of testimony had drawn the attention of investigators who specialized in locations where history and the paranormal intersected with persistent intensity. Ed and Lorraine Warren arrived at the Bellaire house in 1995 as part of a broader investigation into paranormal activity concentrated across the industrial regions of Ohio. The couple had spent decades examining sites where trauma had soaked into physical structures, learning to distinguish between different categories of phenomena. Residual hauntings, mere echoes of past events replaying without consciousness or intent, differed fundamentally from intelligent manifestations that could observe, respond, and pursue specific individuals with deliberate purpose. The challenge at any complex location was determining which type of activity dominated and whether something more dangerous lurked beneath the surface impressions. Lorraine Warren, functioning in her capacity as a clairvoyant and light trance medium, entered the house and immediately registered what she described as a thickness in the atmosphere, a density of presence that indicated multiple sources of paranormal energy occupying the same space. She moved through the ground floor rooms with measured steps, pausing periodically to focus her perception on particular areas where the sensation intensified. In the parlor, she reported sensing the residual imprint of a man standing near the window, forever frozen in the posture of waiting for someone who would never arrive. In the kitchen, she perceived the echo of domestic routine, movements repeated so many thousands of times they had worn grooves into the spiritual fabric of the space. These residual phenomena, while pronounced, did not concern her as threats. They were recordings, nothing more. The basement presented an entirely different quality of experience. As Lorraine descended the wooden stairs into the lower level, she reported an immediate shift in the nature of what she perceived. The residual impressions remained present. She sensed multiple overlapping energies of miners, their final moments of terror and suffocation replaying in endless cycle. But beneath and around these echoes, something else watched. She described it as an intelligence, a focused awareness that tracked her movement and reacted to her presence with what felt like malicious curiosity. This entity, she reported, had learned to feed upon the ambient grief energy generated by the residual phenomena, using the suffering of the mining dead as a power source to amplify its own influence over the physical environment. Ed Warren conducted his investigation with the methodical precision that had defined his decades of fieldwork. He carried baseline electromagnetic field meters, thermometers, and audio recording equipment, documenting temperature variations, unusual electromagnetic spikes, and potential electronic voice phenomena. The basement registered temperature readings consistently 15 to 20 degrees below the ambient temperature of the upper floors, despite the presence of a functional heating system. The electromagnetic readings fluctuated without pattern, spiking and dropping in ways that suggested responsive rather than static conditions. Ed noted these findings in his case file with particular attention to the basement's northwest corner, where both the temperature depression and electromagnetic anomalies reached their peak intensity. The testimony of families who had occupied the house over the preceding decades revealed a disturbing pattern of psychological deterioration. Residents reported that the longer they remained in the house, the more difficult it became to maintain emotional equilibrium. Relationships fractured under the weight of inexplicable tension. Sleep became elusive, interrupted by the sensation of being observed or by vivid nightmares that multiple family members shared with overlapping details. Children spoke of seeing figures in their rooms at night, solid, three-dimensional forms that stood motionless before fading when parents entered in response to screams. Adults reported hearing their names called in voices that mimicked deceased relatives, a phenomenon Ed Warren recognized as a common tactic employed by inhuman entities attempting to establish trust before revealing their true nature. What elevated the Bellaire house beyond a standard haunting in Ed Warren's assessment was the demonstrated intentionality of the primary entity. Residual hauntings could not pursue. They could not adapt their behavior based on observation. They could not target specific individuals who posed a spiritual threat. The intelligence operating within the Bellaire house did all of these things. It appeared to recognize when prayers were being spoken and responded with intensified activity, doors slamming in sequence, objects thrown from shelves, and the overwhelming sensation of hostile presence pressing against those attempting to invoke divine protection. This pattern of responsive aggression indicated an inhuman intelligence, something that had never walked the earth in human form and held nothing but contempt for those who carried the divine spark. Lorraine Warren reported that during her extended time within the house, she perceived the entity attempting to establish contact with her consciousness, probing for vulnerabilities it could exploit to gain influence. She described the sensation as pressure applied to the edges of her awareness, testing her spiritual defenses for weak points. The entity communicated not through language, but through impression, waves of despair, fear, and rage transmitted directly into her emotional center. She recognized the technique as one employed by demonic forces seeking to erode the psychological stability of their targets before attempting more direct forms of oppression or attachment. Her training and spiritual preparation allowed her to maintain boundaries, but she understood that ordinary occupants without such protection would have no defense against this sustained psychological assault. Ed Warren coordinated with local Catholic clergy to arrange a formal blessing of the property, a ritual designed to sanctify the space and command any inhuman presence to depart. The ceremony followed established protocols refined over centuries of ecclesiastical practice, prayers of protection spoken at thresholds, holy water applied to windows and doorways, specific invocations commanding all spirits not of divine origin to release their claim upon the location and its occupants. Lorraine participated as a spiritual anchor, maintaining focused intention while monitoring the entity's response to the ritual. She reported that as the prayers intensified, the entity withdrew deeper into the basement, its presence contracting toward the northwest corner where the activity had always been most concentrated. The resistance she had felt as oppressive weight began to lift incrementally, like fog burning away under morning sun. The blessing focused particular attention on the basement, where Ed and the officiating clergy member spent extended time in prayer and application of sacramentals. Lorraine, maintaining her mediumistic perception, reported that several of the residual presences, the trapped echoes of miners who had perished in the tunnels below, appeared to release during this portion of the ritual. She described seeing impressions of figures moving upward and outward, as though the prayers had provided permission or pathway for energies that had remained earthbound for over a century. The departure of these residual layers, she noted, seemed to weaken the primary entity by removing the ambient grief upon which it had been feeding. The temperature in the basement began to normalize. The electromagnetic readings stabilized. The oppressive atmosphere that had characterized the space since the Warren team's arrival dissipated measurably. Upon completion of the blessing, Ed Warren documented his assessment that the immediate threat had been addressed, but warned that the house remained vulnerable to reinfestation. The historical foundation of trauma upon which the structure rested, the mining deaths, the accumulated grief of generations, created what he termed a spiritually permeable environment, a location where the barrier between the physical and spiritual realms remained thin and required ongoing maintenance to prevent new entities from establishing territory. He recommended that any future occupants maintain regular spiritual practices within the home, particularly prayer and the periodic reapplication of blessed sacramentals, to prevent the house from once again becoming a haven for inhuman intelligence. The Bellaire house continues to operate as a documented paranormal investigation site, with current proprietors facilitating organized research events for investigators and enthusiasts. The phenomena reported by modern visitors bear striking similarity to those catalogued by Ed and Lorraine Warren nearly 3 decades ago. The sensation of being watched, the sound of footsteps from empty rooms, the appearance of shadow figures that demonstrate awareness of observers. The basement remains the focal point of activity, particularly the northwest corner, where the Warren investigation identified the epicenter of the intelligent manifestation. Subsequent investigators have noted the same layered quality Lorraine Warren described, residual impressions overlaid by something that responds, adapts, and appears to possess memory across multiple investigation sessions. Ed Warren's case files on the Bellaire house, preserved within the archives of the New England Society for Psychic Research, serve as a teaching example of locations where industrial tragedy and paranormal infestation became inseparably woven. His notes emphasize the distinction between the human suffering that created residual phenomena and the inhuman intelligence that exploited that suffering for its own purposes. The Warren investigation established protocols for addressing such layered manifestations, acknowledging and releasing the human dead while commanding the departure of entities that had never lived and held no legitimate claim to earthbound residence. The house at 1699 Belmont Street remains standing, its Victorian architecture preserved across more than 170 years of Ohio weather and social change. The coal mines beneath its foundation have long since been abandoned and sealed, but the energy of what transpired in those tunnels continues to permeate the soil and stone. Whether the blessing conducted by Ed Warren and Catholic clergy in 1995 provided permanent resolution or merely temporary respite remains a question answered differently by each new occupant and each new investigation team that descends into the basement, where something still waits in the darkness of the northwest corner, patient as the coal seams themselves, watching for the moment when spiritual vigilance falters and opportunity presents itself once more. If you found this case compelling, subscribe to Vanishing Roads for more documented paranormal investigations from around the world. Number 1847 House. This story was created with AI assistance based on documented case files. All events reference real investigations and reported incidents.